We are going to get to plenty of questions about Russia, but we start with something we'll take a little bit more time over. That's a letter from a young person. I like getting letters from young people. I'm not able to take as much time speaking to young people as I would like. I'm speaking to a group of young people late this week about not just the war, but hopefully democracy and hope. And this is what this letter is about. It's anonymous. It comes from Edinburgh, who is a student at Edinburgh University. And Edinburgh asks, how might I maintain hope? What can we expect in terms of consequences for the Ukraine war from events in American politics? Is there a way out? Talk about a civil war in the United States strikes me as trite, but the emotions undergirding it seem real. I'm also worried about identity politics going too far. For my part, I'll continue to vote and think and listen and reach out to people and remain a proactive citizen no matter what happens. So let's give you a bit of advice about democratic sustenance and hope, but first say a word about the United States. Latent civil war, unfortunately, isn't wrong, because what you've got in the United States is a crisis of closure. Closure in a democracy means that I as a citizen might reject a particular result, but I accept as legitimate the process that's generated that result. And as a result, even if that result has gone against me, I can, as it were, feel closure and move forward and try to win the next time round. But we've got a situation where for millions of people, not just the result, but the process that generates the result feels wrong and illegitimate and untrustworthy in different kinds of quite deep ways. And it does not matter if these people are completely factually wrong, if they are full of baloney, if they've been manipulated, so on and so forth. That don't matter. What matters is how they feel, because when you're dealing with a crisis, democratic crisis, you've got to start with people's actual feelings, not the feelings that we feel they should have. So this is a problem, and it's really serious. Now, in terms of Russia and the United States, since 2014, it's been the stated policy of the Kremlin regime to create instability in countries involved in the previously weaker sanctions regime against Russia. So this is just going to carry on and magnify. And that means that Russians are not necessarily going to take sides in American politics, but they are going to cheer on whatever processes they feel lead to greater chaos, greater instability, and encourage the United States to get preoccupied at home and take its eyes off the ball on the global scene, and in particular in Russia and Ukraine. Some general advice. Look, it's really important to be an independent thinker. That expression has been contaminated by people who use it and follow various thinkers on the intellectual dark web. And now being an independent thinker actually means being a very predictable purveyor of a set of pre-selected positions that often are not just wrong, but that the ill cohere together and then spitting them out often in pre-prepared language. Not at all. What being an independent thinker really means is not absorbing various cliches from the culture and spitting them back out, but putting your own thought together yourself. That doesn't mean it's got to be original, but it's got to be yours. You're not just recycling stuff that comes into you and is then spat back out. That's one thing. Second thing to notice is that even though academics are doing a lot wrong, and even though there's a great crisis in the university system in the United States, in the UK at the moment, universities are still magical places. And they're magical because they, when things go well, have the capacity to generate expertise. And that expertise is something that democracies rely on, because to persist, democracies have to tether themselves to the practiced virtue of truthfulness. So know that universities, when things go well, are magical places. Now, you're worried about identity politics. In your university, there's a building that used to be called the David Hume Tower that's been renamed. And it was renamed because David Hume is not just a great philosopher, but is also a man who had particularly racist views, as indeed did many people in his historical milieu. Briefly, here is what I would say about this. If you are on the side of renaming a building in that kind of situation, then you're going to lose. That's a fad, and it will pass. So even if you are supportive of these kinds of actions, taking down statues, renaming monuments, sometimes that's right in particular cases. But if you are overly in favor of that as a cultural trend of the kind we've had in the West recently, then you will lose, because this is not some kind of progress or accumulation. This will snap. And in fact, the key question is, how bad will the backlash against it be? And what we want to do is do everything in our power for there not to be a backlash. But we've also got to be realistic and anticipate a backlash if it looks like it's going to be on the cards. Tie this stuff back to thinking for yourself. What happens when you think for yourself about this situation? You realize that it's possible, as one of my favorite public intellectuals says, to keep two things in mind at the same time. You can accept that David Hume said some really awful racist stuff that to our eyes is utterly unacceptable, but that he's also the greatest philosopher the British Isles have ever produced. Yeah? And if you accept both, the damn building doesn't need to be renamed. So that conversation can continue, but even if you do favor that sort of trend that we will talk about more systematically in the future, I can guarantee you that you're on the losing side. It's a cultural fad. I am 100% confident about that. We witness these things coming and going in the culture. We witness these things coming and going in the academic culture. This has an interesting consequence, and that's that those who criticize this sort of thing, hyper-identity politics from the right, like Jordan Peterson, are mistaken by pointing out the authoritarian threat. There isn't, in the end, an authoritarian threat there, because despite the authoritarian tendencies, this thing will snap and go away and be replaced, hopefully without too much of a backlash. But that's optimistic. And so therefore, the risk there isn't authoritarianism, but damage to our democratic discourse and collapse in our capacity to talk together, think for ourselves, engage with issues in a way that includes all citizens rather than framing them in terms of some citizens versus others and so on. So this is hugely, hugely damaging, but not for the reason of it being some kind of catastrophic authoritarian threat. It isn't, because it's going to go away. And look, now about progress and regress in democracy. We are coming out of the bay and we're going into open ocean, but we're not going to sink. So the complacency of pretending we're in the bay when we're not, it's got to go out of the window. But so is the catastrophizing that says we're sinking, because we're not. A democracy in crisis is still a way better place to be than Belarus or Russia. So you've got to accept that. And then realize that, look, one of the things that's really constructive, but also healthy and healing when you're deeply worried about some kind of systemic threat is to take action. And what that means just depends on one's personality. For some people, action can just be thought. Action can just be engaging deeply, for example, with possibilities of democratic regeneration, talking about them, talking about how we might transform politics at a local level to help with some of the crises we face at the level of national politics and so on. So being proactive is something that's a very powerful medicine for, the ill of being challenged by a very big systemic problem in one's society. Brandon asks, does Putin hold any resentment or negative feelings towards Shoigu for the shortcomings of the special military operation? Yes, he holds lots of shortcomings toward all kinds of people, including Shoigu, I'm sure. But he is tethered to Shoigu such that it would be easier for him to de facto rather than de jure demote Shoigu. In other words, it's possible that if Shoigu were moved, that he'd be formally kept in his post, but just taken off from his current duties. David asks, individual life seems to matter less in Russia and seems to be treated more cheaply by Russian politics now and for centuries. Why is this? What is the cultural difference involved? Is there something I'm missing? David, you're right. There is this difference. And to explain it, we're going to need a complex historical and sociological story that we're not going to reach for now. We're going to put on the table a couple of really important approaches to thinking about this that you've got to get right before you get to that explanatory sociological historical story. So here's what you've got to do. First of all, realize that the single most basic ethical conception of modern human beings is that we are all of equal moral worth. That is my most basic ethical belief, and it's yours too. Whether you think it consciously or not, it's yours too. And even human beings who don't practice that, or evil dictators, and even human beings who don't think that all the way, still think it's some of the way. In other words, that conception is so elementary to us that you've got to pay lip service to it even as you flagrantly transgress against it. But realize that conception isn't some kind of elementary logical move. It isn't something that just falls from the sky. It's a contingent historical development that didn't have to arise, but it arose relatively recently, in the last 3 centuries or so. And before, it's not there. To us, it's natural. To the ancient Greeks, it wasn't. To them, the institution of slavery was an inevitable social situation, such that you couldn't really question it. You couldn't ask whether it was just or unjust, because you simply couldn't imagine society without it. You couldn't think your way out of that way of going on, just like we can't think of that way of going on. But that doesn't mean that where we've ended up is inevitable. It rather means that it's a very special historical development, and to understand how it works, you've got to look at how it came about, what the history involved here is. So think of it historically and contingently. Don't think of it as just an elementary bit of logic that falls at you from the sky. So that's really helpful. First thing. Second thing I highly recommend is don't think of the Russians as weird. Think of us as weird here. Think of how much it takes to sustain a society that, in a semi-decent way, puts a premium on each individual life. That is the rarer social situation. That is the weirder social situation. That requires many more buffers, conditions, historical bits of luck and bits of privilege to sustain all of that. So think of us as the weirdos and the Russians as the more normal ones in how you understand what sustains this in practice and what undermines it in practice. That's the beginning of this conversation. Tay asks, why do you think the UK is one of the leading supporters of Ukraine? Well, before you answer that, you've got to admit that when we talk about that global network that props up the Putin regime, London was very deeply complicit with it. And so we can't paint UK in an innocent way when it comes to our story of what's globally been propping up the Putin regime. But having said this, one fact you've got to consider is the UK-US special relationship. So partly for the UK, strongly supporting Ukraine is a maneuver in the US-UK special relationship. The second thing you've got to realize is that to some extent it's strong support, but to some extent it's support plus a lot of loud shouting about the support. So make that distinction. The third thing to realize is that Bojo, the ex-Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, wanted to show that the UK could take a global leadership role despite Brexit, and he wanted to find some kind of an issue on which he could just go and get success, because his premiership was affected both by scandal and significant policy failure across the board. So that's part of the story too. That's number 3. Number 4, look, I think there is also room for a genuine understanding of how the Putin regime constitutes a security threat to all of the West. And that understanding isn't as obstructed for the UK as it is in countries with a more complex and a more nuanced history about not just their relationship with Russia, but their self-conception on the global stage. So Germany has had problems understanding the security threat that Russia poses to the world, and the UK hasn't. In France, too, the way the basic French conception of their foreign policy role as a kind of global arbiter inclines them has meant that they have been slow to realize that we've got to take a stand toward isolating Russia and saying that Russia is going to be outside of our table of politics, at least insofar as we're going to penalize it as much as we can for the attack on Ukraine. So that stuff has been easier for the UK to see in some ways. UK has had to do less work to see this than France or Germany, for instance. Arnoud asks, what are your thoughts on Arestovych? He accurately predicted the war in 2019. Well, he actually predicted it many years before then too, at least in a slightly less defined way. But Ukraine seems to have done nothing about it. What are your thoughts? No, I think that Arestovych is very important as part of this thing I constantly emphasize. Ukraine's need to do a better job of talking to itself about itself. And what the public intellectual Andrei Baumeister likes to say, Ukrainian public intellectual philosopher who knows Arestovych very well, they've done a lot of stuff together. He says Ukraine needs more Arestoviches, but Arestoviches who aren't like this Arestovych. So Arestovych is one of the very few people in the country who gets the country to talk to itself and face some challenging questions. But you need more of that, and you need people who think very differently to Arestovych to develop and enrich the country's conversation about what the hell it is politically. That's the first observation I'd make. I think that Arestovich's prediction was very impressive. Not right in every way, because he felt that success in the war would get Ukraine into Western alliances, and it's not clear that that's going to happen. What Ukraine's state of readiness was is a complex question. Obviously, it was far superior to its state of readiness just several years before the war. I think that the Ukrainian government was clear that Russia was going to engage in a military operation in Ukraine, but they weren't sure that this was going to be a full-scale war. They thought that it might be a partial intervention. And then they, discovered what it was, like all of us did on the 24th of February. That's too brief, perhaps, to be helpful, but this is just a couple of remarks. Pavel asks, what's your take on the Tocqueville effect? Is it real, and is there any relevance to Russia? Pavel, that's a big question. Let's put a couple of things on the table and see if that helps a little bit. Now, the Tocqueville effect is the idea that as social conditions improve, social dissatisfaction might actually go up and not down. And that's sort of derived from a very elegant and beautiful set of sentences in de Tocqueville. I'm going to talk about him. He's a very important thinker another time. I think the first thing that's worth putting down on the table is that even in privileged societies, the folks at the bottom are scared and are really struggling. You know, in the United States, there are tens of millions of families who feel fear about how they're going to make ends meet and how they're going to feed themselves, you know, a month from now. And they don't just fear that they might not be able to support themselves in the near future. They also fear that that fear isn't going to go away. There's always going to be permanently sort of besetting them. That's bad. Is it as bad as a Syrian family that's putting its children on a boat into the sea with an uncertain prospect of arrival? No, it's not. Obviously, they're very different kinds of fear. But the less bad situation of the two shouldn't be underestimated nevertheless. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that there are modes of social dislocation and alienation in the West that are independently occurring. They are not a product of life getting relatively easier, as it has done. I mean, compare where we are to where we would have been in 1922. So of course, life's got easier, but a lot of the dislocation and alienation that you find in our society is developing for different reasons. So don't confuse here correlation with causation. I mean, for example, there's a special problem around how much we question our relationship with everything, with how self-conscious we are about all of our ways of relating to the world, and how much we are perhaps at risk of not even being able to stably believe in certain things that are good things to believe in if they were true, but now we're discovering they're not necessarily true because you keep questioning them, keep questioning everything. So there's a problem, for example, with the special reflectiveness of the modern world. And that's one of the causes of inherent dissatisfaction. So don't confuse things getting easier with folks getting dissatisfied. But is there something to it? Yes, I do think there is, but that again is a conversation for another time. Jörn asks, will there be any point at which Putin needs to intervene and do something, maybe something drastic about Prigozhin and Kadyrov who are constantly acting out? Not yet. If what they were doing, which is talking about how this or that should be done differently around the war, really pissed Putin off badly, they wouldn't do it. He's too strong at the moment for them to do things that would piss him off. So he's either relatively indifferent to it or he likes it. And it could be a bit of both. Because Putin is certainly interested in folks in his court. He doesn't really have a court anymore, but in the loosest sense of court, just measuring sort of kind of a distance around him where certain figures of importance lie. In that sense of a court, he wants that court to quarrel rather than to be seriously united in some kind of strategic picture of the future. Google Day asks, would Putin not invade Ukraine in Feb, knowing what he knows now, or would he have still done it? So he has mostly convinced himself that as badly as this has gone, doing it is inevitable. But I think if you rewind back to February and you tell him how bad it's going to go, he'd be reluctant, I think. There is a story by Solovey, who is this guy who constantly spreads rumors or information about Putin's health by talking to some people involved with the regime. And he does get lots of leaks, but some of them are deliberately misleading. And he said, and I'm not inviting you to put any trust on this, I'm just putting it out there as a bit of gossip really, that Gerasimov, head of the Russian army, strategy was actually not to invade, but spend 2 weeks bombarding Ukraine from the air and rocketing Ukraine, and then, God knows what, presumably reassess or invade. So that's interesting. I think that Putin had a problem, which is that he thought that this had to be done for reasons we've already talked about. Ukraine is an existential threat to his life. It's a threat to his regime. It's a threat to Russian culture sustaining itself. In Putin's mind, that's all true. So he probably would have thought, look, I'm getting old. We don't know what his health problems are. This could be a long story. And if it goes well or less well, it needs to be begun so that there is some prospect of me taking it several steps forward before I have to pass things over, because I have very little confidence in anybody around me doing this well. So that doesn't answer your question, but that's a little something at least. Eamon asks, at some point in the near future, the Russian people are going to experience a psychotic break. 20% of them have. Maybe 10-15% at least. What do you think will happen when that reality arrives? And what can the West do to help psychically rebuild them? That's a huge question. So let me just again say a couple of things. That psychic break happened for Russians who are in that small minority that are vehemently anti-war, vehemently anti-Putin. Even for those of them who predicted the war, that break still occurred, because it's so shocking for Russia to attack a country that is its closest neighbor, with many, many familial ties as well between the two countries. It's profoundly shocking. It's the most self-destructive and insane thing that Russia could do. The best way to follow Russia talking about this sort of psychic shock with itself is arguably the conversations online, the interviews online that Katya Gardeva is doing on her YouTube channel, Tell Gardeva, Скажи Gardevой. Some of them do have English subtitles, but I think the majority don't. But that's worth checking out. So that shock has already happened. But the big question is, how is that big blob in the middle, the passive blob, going to be impacted by this, and when? And at the moment, there's very little movement there. There's a little bit of movement, but it's only a little bit. So we're going to have to see how that goes. Daniel asks, what about the loss of people due to war and due to mass immigration? How does it compare to similar instances in Russia's USSR's past? Well, just before the USSR was the USSR, 100 years ago, in 1922, there was the Filosofsky Parahod, the philosopher's ship, which is a story of folks leaving by train, by boat, philosopher's ship. And this is a story of Russia's scientific and intellectual elite leaving and being kicked out. And Trotsky said about these folks that it's not quite worth executing them, but they can't be tolerated either, so off they go. I think the commentary today is that 20% of the population, or if you want to be strict, 10-15% of the population, that vehemently opposes the war, the regime, and so on, they're in a situation whereby basically the regime is at war with them. And some of them have run away. But those who haven't are in a relationship with their regime That is different to the Ukrainian people because they're not having bombs falling on their heads. But nevertheless, if they try to be themselves in any way in public, they're going to be beaten up, killed, jailed, fired. So that's an important point, and we have to wait and see how this story explodes. Paloma asks, is there any truth, and I'm paraphrasing you if that's okay, to the claim that woke cancellation tactics are being used to silence a part of the Ukraine debate, such that proposals for negotiation and peace can't be heard? I reject such proposals. I think they're a misunderstanding of where the war is at, and they're a misunderstanding of the aspirations and operations of the Kremlin. But nevertheless, these views that I reject need to be heard, not just in our public square, but in particular inside the universities and the academy. It's important that the kind of views that John Mearsheimer or Noam Chomsky are advancing have place in the academy, that they are neither inhibited nor deplatformed. We have a problem with this. And the problem with having a problem with this is that the universities give us expertise that is not tethered to some kind of instrumentalized political mission. And in doing so, they tether our liberal democracies to the practiced virtue of truthfulness. And in doing that, they allow our democracies to persist. So this is vitally important. You might think that it's okay if we just silence this here, that there, because that's what we really want. That's really extraordinarily dangerous once you understand the function of the university. So if there is an academic there who says, well, look, God damn it, Ukraine's defending itself, this is a horrendously unjust genocidal war, but here I'm going to do a seminar on war crimes committed by countries that are fighting just and defensive wars against aggressors. And I'm going to make clear that any war crimes that might have been committed by Ukraine, for instance, the execution of Russian soldiers, are infinitesimal compared to the vast ocean of war crimes that Russia's committed. But we're going to talk about this, we're going to analyze the history, we're going to analyze patterns of how this works and so on. You don't want that sort of thing to be undoable and unspeakable. And you might think, well, there's no big deal here. But actually, no, it is a big deal once you understand the function of that institution and its relationship to democracy. Jenny asks, do you think that Putin is a narcissist? No. Or possibly a psychopath, maybe as he comes across as not caring for anything but what he wants, which is money and power, and not caring for anybody's life either. Jenny, I think the key story there is twofold. The first bit is we've got a, KGB, FSB character. And second, and even more importantly, we've got a character who has sat at the top of an amorphous authoritarian regime. And anybody who does that for enough time is going to lose the plot. I mean, that's inevitable. Journalists who work in countries that are dictatorships often say, if they're there for more than 15 years, they inevitably lose contact with reality and inevitably go potty. And Putin has gone fanatical in all kinds of ways, fanatical about his bizarre visions and commitments. And that's a product of deterioration that is a consequence of his job, his position. In other words, if he had decided to move to Spain and live there and engage in some kind of a business project instead of staying as Russia's president, or instead of ever becoming Russia's president, he wouldn't be going around Spain doing evil deeds, So we're talking about an FSB agent, which is unlovely already, And then over and above that, much more importantly, we're talking about this extraordinary deterioration, human deterioration that inevitably occurs to anybody in his position. Would we call him a psychopath or a sociopath? If you're a psychologist who says that you'd want to think of psychopaths as people who walk into the world like that, you probably couldn't call him a psychopath, but you could call him a severe sociopath easily. Rowena asks, I'm wondering whether you start from or are following a particular ethical framework or set of principles in what you do. Regards from an Australian who is coming to appreciate the danger of giving up on politics. Thank you so much. I'm loving and missing Oz every day, always. I think that in the history of the West, there are two ways of thinking about ethics and morality. And there's one that I absolutely accept and one that I absolutely reject. One says, look, we've got to arrive at a set of principles, rationally deduced, around which ethical life ought to be organized. I completely reject that. The other one says, look, ethics emanates out of human psychology. Only a deep understanding of how the mind works, what it's like to find oneself inside one's mind. Out of that is going to come our story about how ethical life works. And it's not going to be a theory, it's not going to be a set of principles. That's what I accept. The theorization of the content of ethical life, I vehemently reject. It doesn't matter what that theorization is. So do I have a set of principles? No. I think the idea that ethical life centers around a set of principles is an illusion. This has been asked several times by different people. Is fact-checking good or bad for democracy? In principle, fact-checking is a normatively impeccable enterprise. But in practice, we've got a fact-checking crisis that actually threatens our democracy. What's happened is that journalistic institutions are politicizing fact-checking in a way that's very dangerous. For instance, I was talking about a year ago with a YouTuber who got fact-checked by a journalistic institution. And I actually feel the institution got it right, but not all the way. And that's an absolute catastrophe. It's a catastrophe for, let's say, the New York Times to do a fact check and be 90% right. That 10% that's left is so damaging, is so corrosive. Because once you insert your own values and your own political project into your fact check, it becomes a complete catastrophe. So fact-checking needs to be very minimal, and then it can be practiced successfully. But that's not what we've got at the moment. We've got fact-checking of value positions even happening in our culture. And that is so profoundly damaging. It's unbelievable. The other aspect of this, and I know how the BBC works from inside, I don't know other institutions that well, but in the BBC, a lot of the fact-checking is done by people who are not the people who do the serious, hard-nosed journalism. It's often a couple of young people who are writing a little piece for the BBC website, and they're fact-checking something, and they don't have the experience to do it properly. And for the BBC to label that enterprise as their fact-checking, branch, department, dimension, or whatever, is so self-destructive for that institution. It's really, really painful. So we've got a catastrophic crisis of fact-checking. You can fact-check around whether Barack Obama is in Mongolia today, of course, but you cannot fact-check around whether Barack Obama has inappropriate sympathies with inappropriate people. That is not fact-checkable. There's lots of ghastly, unbelievably false, toxic beliefs that should not be fact-checked. So this institution is so bad at the moment in its most, common practice, that it's better to simply stop it than carry on doing it the way we're doing it. We are losing the trust of large segments of the population when we do politicized fact checks. Fact checks need to be minimal, and I could rant on about this for a week. How and to what extent is the medium the message for Vlad? There is the message. The message is dressed in rhetorical clothes with which it is constitutively inseparable, that are an expression of my style and of my authenticity and personality. And then that then is also, to some extent, geared toward the particular coercive medium requirements of wherever it is I'm sharing what I'm sharing. But it's these three. But the key thing is that there's got to be a story of authenticity running all the way through, such that if you're using YouTube, you use YouTube rather than YouTube using you. And the problem we've got with many YouTubers that are political analysts and their channels are growing is that they start off using YouTube, but very soon YouTube comes to use them. And that's what's really, really important to avoid. And you might think that just being ethically sound makes you avoid it. No. Being stable makes you avoid that. Having rich intellectual anchoring that is independent of your work on YouTube helps you avoid that. Tom asks, do you think Russia is redeemable? My worry is that Russia is a society that is rotten to the core. I tried to think that it was just Putin, but when I see Kherson and Bucha and all the unaccountable war crimes, I don't know what to think anymore. Tom, I think that societies like people get sick, and they can get chronically sick, like people. And Russian culture is a bit sick. Russian politics is very sick. Now, some of that sickness isn't a product of things that are distinctive features of Russian culture, but is just a product of certain kinds of conditions that can be sociologically explained. So certain things go really, really wrong when you have tyranny, for example. But it's also true that some of what's wrong is distinctively part of deformations in Russian culture. So you've got to accept that. But what you want is an explanation of how Russia has got to this place, and a story about where it's going to go, and a story about where it can go, and a story about where it should go. But I think there's a risk of speaking in cliches when we talk about Russia being redeemable or not redeemable, or whether it being rotten to the core or not. Once these phrases are interrogated, it'll become apparent that they're taken off the shelf. And so what I encourage instead is for you to think this through for yourself. Could you steel man Putin? Is there anything redeemable within him at all, or is it all just nonsense? I don't love the term steel manning. It's, again, normatively impeccable, but in our culture, it's typically used by folks in the intellectual dark web, and it's often used deleteriously. In other words, the people talking about steel manning some kind of position they oppose typically haven't done enough to understand it. So don't steel man or steel woman, but continue being curious, continue exploring, and enhance your understanding. Steel manning, the way we practice it in our culture, in our internet culture, typically just stops thought. But Putin, speaking about Putin, as Vladimir Pastukhov, the wonderful commentator on the Russian regime, likes to say, always makes his lies and his delusions half-truths and not complete falsehoods. There's plenty that Putin could say. Putin could talk about the decline of the West. he doesn't believe in democracy, and he believes that the West is going to die. And he's wrong about that, but it is true that Western democracy is in decline, and that's a crisis, and there's a crisis of trust in the West. Sure. Putin could talk about the expansion of NATO and how incremental expansion of NATO provoked Russia. Now, when we talk about NATO, understand that the alternative to the gradual expansion of NATO isn't just not expanding NATO. There's also a third option that's not talked about enough, and that's expanding NATO in one go, which would have been obviously difficult for different reasons. But imagine NATO being expanded all the way to Russia's border sometime before 2010, before 2008. There wouldn't have been the Ukraine war. Putin could talk about the teacherly approach taken toward Russia by Western powers after the Soviet Union collapsed. Putin could talk about how the West didn't engage enough with Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. And now speaking as myself, there's a lot to that. And the point isn't that we should have acceded to Russia's demands for its sphere of influence. It's rather that we should have tried to do a much better job of persuading Russia into our way of thinking. Putin could also say that early on in his reign, he tried to position himself so that he would be an equal partner cooperating with Western powers. They didn't see him like an equal partner. Now our answer might be, well, Russia's just not that major a power. It's not the United States. But Putin was still aspiring to be taken as an equal, and he wasn't, and he got very resentful about that. So there's a great deal he could say. He could talk about the regime change wars the West has engaged in, the war crimes the West has committed. So all of that, but steel manning Putin is just going to reveal to us this sort of half-truth story. And we're going to see elements of truth to some of his beliefs, but we're also going to see extraordinary delusions, extraordinary detachment from reality, and a kind of unbelievable fragmentation and degeneration of his personality as his years in power have gone by. Given how slow we are, I'm going to try to accelerate. BdeMontgomery asks, Vlad, your cultural duality must at times cause great conflict. Could you talk about what it's like to grow up in both? So I grew up between the Soviet Union, Israel, and the United Kingdom. I don't feel torn at all. I feel largely West European. I'm most psychologically at home in Central Europe. I'm most physically at home in the Pacific or in Australia. I love that part of the world physically, and I've spent much time there, lived there. And my personality is sort of tinged with some kind of a Russian dimension. But that dimension is subtle. It's lovely for me to explore. And I feel curiosity and a sense of layers and richness. I feel no conflict at all. But that part of me that I would say is Russian, or is sort of colored by Russianness, is obviously very extraordinarily unhappy about the war. And because of that Russian part of who I am probably more pro-Ukraine than most people who are pro-Ukraine, in the sense that there's a lot of people who just are anti-Russia. But because of my Russian roots, I am strongly not just anti-Russia in this war, but pro-Ukraine, because these are close neighbors who shouldn't be attacked by these. Next, Priscilla Fortuna asks, what should citizens do when their democracy is falling apart or turning divisive and people are giving up on it, except just move to parts of the country where you feel the situation is better. Because we're trying to be brief, let me just say that one thing I'm very passionate about is, first, the idea of not giving up on sharing a table of politics with people you find difficult to tolerate. And something else that's really important is that you go not to what people are saying, but to what they feel, to the fears they have, the insecurities they have. And here we reach a taxonomy about breakdown of trust that I've covered in a video on the main channel. Rory asks, how should you deal on social media with people expressing strong pro-Russian opinions? Should you take logic and facts to them in a calm and unemotional way? Are there any mental tools? Well, look, Rory, I think that might require a separate video, but briefly I would say this. Most of the time, when somebody feels sort of like their monitors to planet Earth have been turned off, it's not a good idea to argue with them about the issue, you know? Because if I told you that Mount Everest isn't very tall, isn't very high, you should recognize that my problem is not an incapacity to recognize the height of mountains. I've got some other kind of problem that's deeper than that. I've got a problem somehow with making sense of reality, distinguishing illusion from reality. And if somebody's in that predicament, you shouldn't argue with them about Mount Everest. You should realize that something has gone wrong at a previous stage and that the mountain ain't the issue. It's one thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is that when this is sincere, when people aren't professionally trolling, then very often it's not ignorance but denial. And it's a very important psychological distinction. And with many Russians, the problem with recognizing the butchers that took place isn't that they aren't informed, it's that they can't go there. Because if they go there, they'll recognize that their entire political accommodation with the regime, their entire informal deal with the regime, whereby the regime does what it wants and they stay out of politics, has ended in catastrophe. So these are a couple of my comments. And our last question is, does the West believe it can have its cake and eat it too by hoping it can help Ukraine win the war, but in such a way that Putin doesn't notice that he has lost? Okay, so this is the question that basically says, why aren't we going harder in our support for Ukraine? Because we can't surely pander to Putin's perception of his own red lines. If we want Ukraine to win, surely we should do everything to make it win and stop thinking about where X or Y is going to be considered provocative in Moscow. I don't understand the logic of the careful approach. Is there any difference for the chances of Putin escalating, including going nuclear, if he loses with Western help or loses with less Western help? Okay, so look. I believe, capacity allowing, we should go even further than we're going in supporting Ukraine. Because I believe that Ukraine's victory isn't guaranteed. Ukraine's victory is a matter of our commitment being sustained. And there's good reason to accept the reality that fatigue will be setting in. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried about escalation. Why not? Because escalation isn't about Putin's red lines. Escalation is about unforeseen events leading to unforeseen new scenarios and unforeseen processes of reconsideration of one's position. So escalation isn't just one side deciding they're going to go further and then the other side deciding how they're going to respond. Escalation is a snowball sort of process. And that's why the West has been so careful about not wanting to have its weapons fired on Russian territory too much, not doing a no-fly zone, not engaging in a direct confrontation with Russia, Western forces coming into conflict with Russia. So there's absolutely reason to be careful, because our moral outrage about what's happening could get us killed in a nuclear war. At the same time, we shouldn't indulge Putin's nuclear blackmail, and I believe we should support Ukraine even more than we are currently supporting them. So this is the balance that needs to be struck. But this is not a matter of Putin's red lines. It's a matter of our red lines about what we judge to be excessively risky as we achieve our strategic aims by supporting Ukraine. And that's why certain decisions clearly do make sense, like not doing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, for instance. So it's better to think of those red lines as being ours, not Putin's. We should support Ukraine more, but nevertheless, we want to avoid an uncontrollable cascade of escalation.